This is Justice Worriers, a podcast where we think about things that are right and wrong in our world and how Christian ideas can help us respond to them. We prefer hard questions over easy answers, and we'd love you to join us in our ramblings. Listen in and contact us using the links in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Justice Warriors episode 33. My name's Andy and as usual I'm joined by Leah. Say hi, Leah.
Hi there.
And Jörg. Say hi, Jörg.
Hello.
Hello, and today we're talking, we don't quite know what the title should be. We're talking about population, refugees, stuff like that. So the context of this conversation is, I guess the immediate context is that the UK has just started a policy of deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda in order to process their claims there. The wider context in the UK is that we're getting used to the idea of Brexit and the UK being outside the European Union. Also in the news recently is the overturning of the right to abortion in the US, and in some states moving to ban abortion. And then the very global context is world population, which I looked it up just now. World population in 1919 was about 1.8 billion. Now it's about 7.8 billion. And probably it will peak around 2100 at about 11 billion. So we want to talk about, should we be talking about population growth as a problem? What's the biblical view of population, migration, refugees, stuff like that? We're not sure where this is going to go. We're quite uncertain how to even cover this topic, but we feel like there are things to be discussed, and we want to start that conversation. So hopefully, listener, you'll join in with us, but we're going to give it a go. So we didn't have any homework, so let's start with our worries. Leah, how would you like to start with your worries about this topic?
So my worries about this topic are that we take a very simplistic view about population. Those numbers that Andy just read out are kind of scary sounding. It's easy to just feel that there are just too many people in this world, and I think politicians on the left, particularly people who are concerned environmentalists, can kind of be a bit scare tacticy around population, and also people on the right who want to use it to make arguments about immigration. And I just don't think it's all that simple. And also, it's a very strange issue in that it's at the macro scale, at the global scale, talking about billions of people, but then it affects the individual, and it comes down to some very intimate decisions about how we all live our lives, and it comes down to birth of new creation, new people. So I think my worries are that we take a very complex issue that is multi-layered and operates in loads of different dimensions, and we just have quite a simplistic, almost gut reaction to the fact that there are now so many people in this world.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying I should close the worldometer clock I have running on my other screen here? It just ticks up one person every half second.
Is it ticking them up in a good way, like hooray, more people, or in a bad way, like oh my goodness, we can't cope?
It's the beauty of the eye of the beholder, but it's just current. It just says current world population.
There's no it's kind of dynamite sticks and.
There's no dynamite sticks, but there's also not like bubbly hearts flying out of it or baby screams,
little babies or fireworks.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just cold hard numbers.
Yeah. It's just cold hard numbers and how you feel about it, and then a ranking of the most populous countries.
Populous or populist?
Populist. Populous countries. As a popular is not. It's not popular. It's not populist.
Population leads to populism.
That's right. And the UK is nowhere on the list, so to be seen. He was not among the top 20.
No,
Germany is, though, top 19.
Really?
No, I didn't realise
So
that.
I have a right to be worried. You don't.
That's interesting, because the majority of Europe has really low population growth.
Well, no, this
This is
absolute
population
numbers.
size. Yeah.
Oh, this is
It's population
size.
size.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Right,
so
okay,
it's
yeah,
still
it
slightly
wasn't
bigger
growth.
country, but
Yeah, right, that
but
makes more
yeah,
sense.
it's not relative to size or anything like that. Relative to
okay.
geographic extension, anything like that.
Okay.
So
But I was
go on.
quite interested in what you said about the sort of global versus the individual, and I mean, are we out of our depth that we just have a hard time breaking down the sort of global conversation?
You mean
the
as
three of
a
us. The three of
species or
us.
as a podcast?
As a species, though,
As a species, right? Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
we seem to have issues to comprehend global processes like exponential growth. Anyway, we have a very hard time with. We don't really understand what happens in finances, and the people who pretend they do still fail to predict when it really crashes. We don't seem to get a handle on climate change in such a way that it actually informs how we live in drastic measures. Is this like a new problem that we just haven't got used to yet, to think in those numbers?
Have you heard of the Long Now Foundation?
No.
It's a group. So I've just opened their webpage. It says it's a non-profit established in the year 1996 to foster long-term thinking.
Nice.
They do things. They have a clock somewhere, like a physical clock, that they built inside a mountain that's designed to keep accurate time for the next 10,000 years, and stuff like that. They're working to try and help us as a species become better at thinking about this stuff.
About global longer changes.
Now, I hesitate to recommend them because it'll probably turn out they're some horrific cult, but
Yeah.
it's sort of interesting anyway.
But I mean, coming back to sort of the alarmism, I still have that clock open, and if I scroll down a bit, I see the curve, and you've all seen the curve, and it's easy to pull up in Wikipedia or whatever, dear listener. And it is very clearly an exponential growth curve up until the 2010s. That's when it begins leveling off. It's still going up. It's beginning to level off. Projections are going in all sorts of directions. And perhaps for the first time ever, it's not leveling off because of war or, global pandemics as much as we were hit by COVID. That's not the huge hit to population, certainly not in the most populous countries in relative terms. But the curve looks frightening in a sense
But hold on, you should stop there, right? So, we don't celebrate that masses and masses of people aren't dying of famine.
because we see that in other ecosystems, right? I mean,
Yeah, so why don't we move on to my worry then, because this is essentially my worry. So just from a climate perspective, in the widest possible sense of can we grow enough food and can we get together enough water for people? Each person eats a certain amount of food, drinks a certain amount of water, and at least, perhaps with water we can just use energy to get more. So if we find better ways of getting energy, we might find a way out. That might also be true of food. But anyway, the point is, there is some physical limit to the amount of food and water we can produce as a species. We don't know whether we're anywhere near that in terms of technology. I think we certainly do know that without technology, we would already be well past what we could support, what population we could support based on traditional farming methods. So, maybe there is just a correct number of people and maybe we are shooting past that number. That's my worry.
I have big issues with that.
I want to hear them, dear, because you raised some. The reason I was a bit hesitant saying that is because I really like the points you made when I said this before we started recording.
I can't claim to actually be a proper geographer, but I did dabble in a few bits of geography at university and whatever, and it's a big debate there about whether population intensity is a a good thing or not. But there's definitely evidence that the more people, the more challenge that a particular ecosystem faces, the more humans innovate and the better solutions we come up with in order to live with the resources that we have. And yes, there are difficulties in providing food and water for such huge numbers of people, but we had the green revolutions back in the 20th century that hugely
which weren't so green at all.
They were not green. They were green in terms of green shoots of things growing. I don't think they were ever meant to be green in the organic
ecological sense.
Ecological sense. But we hugely increased the amount of food that we could produce.
It's very exciting for you to be arguing for technology progress rather than me and progress.
Yeah, I know. But I think this idea that there are limits just plays into the idea that everything's scarce and that we all just need to protect our own, rather than working together to create more. Nobody's ever going to properly answer the question about whether there are limits or not, but humans are incredibly ingenious. And that's even before you talk about the issue of resource distribution, which is a separate issue.
Okay, I have two people wrestling inside me right now. One is a gardener, and the other one is somebody who wants to be generous and have parties. So how do we reconcile those two tendencies? Because yes, in a way, I think you're right. This is about abundance. This is about having the right mindset, not be operating in sort of this mentality of fear and scarcity when we have around us a world that's so beautiful. But on the other hand, my gardener then says, but the world is rare, it's precious, it does need some taking care of, because otherwise I'm saying the future is urbanization, industrialization of food production, all the kinds of stuff that we're seeing, because that's what that means, because the traditional methods of farming and so on are not going to be, and settling, are not going to be sufficient to sustain huge amounts of population.
You justify those that die by wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. Those who died are justified for wearing the badge, they're the chosen whites. They justify those that died, they're the chosen whites.
So that's interesting. So we've already talked, I think, about two biblical ideas. One is abundance. I think we should talk more about where we see that idea in the Bible. The other one is urbanization. And the thing that I see sometimes in the Bible is a real joy and celebration of cities that I think we culturally really disagree with. Like, even if we kind of love to live in the city, we also feel like, we're paving over the world and it's evil and awful.
It's one of my problems with heaven, so it's a city.
Yeah.
And but the Bible it's a city with trees in the middle, right? Why do we create these city
so many
deserts?
parks in London, and it really doesn't.
Yeah, but they're not. But they're parks. They're
great, by the way.
They are great.
They're great, but it still doesn't take away.
They're modelled on the parkland of the aristocracy, which was never meant to be productive or useful. It was just meant to show wealth and splendour. So they were created in order to show that. Yeah, but we sort of said that they were maybe for the poor people to get some soot out of their lungs. But mainly we created them to show that Victorian London was wealthy enough to be able to dedicate what could be productive space to strolling arm in arm down a boulevard. So they are not a good example of how cities could be green. There's all sorts of ecological things you can do in cities, grow plants up buildings, create actual productive allotments within parks, all these things.
And by the way, the cities are way more efficient in terms of use of resource per person, way more efficient than other types of settlement.
But they're not creation, they're not gardens, they are all man-made.
We don't give that any space. We make it all man-made.
But when did you start excluding humans from creation?
Yeah. That's maybe it's not a gardener, it's a romantic that always thinks the things were perfect at the beginning. I don't know. I hear you, and there's plenty of animals in the cities, and we have our frog ponds in our gardens, but at the same,
there aren't enough. There should definitely be.
There
more.
aren't enough, and it's very limited, and it's all very intensified living in that sense.
But that's because of the choices we've made about the way we've created our cities. You know, lawns were created so that the gentry could show that they didn't have to use every ounce of soil for production. Yeah, but why do we still have parks that look like that in the centre of our cities?
But also, you do have to acknowledge that intensity is the same thing as efficiency, right? And
there will be a limit to what you can do in a city.
From a climate point of view, you know, that intensity is what we need to use our resources efficiently enough. Unless, of course, Leah's right that we've got plenty of resources if we just put our minds to it.
I think so. We've spent the last 60, 70 years devoting all our agricultural expertise towards creating better fertilizers made out of petrochemicals and to mechanizing everything. Imagine, it's like the nuclear thing, isn't it? Imagine if we put all that energy that we put into developing nuclear power stations 50 years ago. Imagine if we put that into solar panels back then. Imagine if we'd dedicated our effort that we've put into those specific forms of intensive fossil fuel-based agriculture. Imagine if we put the amount of R&D, the amount of time, care, effort, money into forms of agriculture that actually work with nature. We'd be light years ahead. We've just not chosen to deploy our resources in that way.
Awesome. Jörg, what are your worries?
You're still not looking convinced.
No,
I just think humans
I'm
can
listening.
do this stuff. They just don't try. We just
I
try to do one thing that we think is the right thing.
I just think it's not. It's perhaps not so much either or, because there is a point at which it's still not going to work. So a lot of the agricultural methods that work more with nature, they need time. You know, land needs to rest. You can't use heavy machinery because it compacts the soil like that. You have to actually use some waste to be reabsorbed. You know, you have to break up the large lands, so, you know, have hedges in between so that you actually have a better ecosystem. And all of those things will kill efficiency. Rightly so, I think, because there's a problem with efficiency, but that will, in the end, limit what you can do.
Yeah, we've already criticised efficiency on this podcast, haven't we?
We've already killed efficiency?
Yeah, criticised efficiency.
Yeah, I'm worried it's coming. Oh, well, yes. But I'm worried progress is coming back, so I kind of need to...
I just think it's impossible to look at the future of innovation, and for every innovation 20 years ago you'd have looked at IT and talked about all sorts of physical or you looked at all kinds of limits that there were to the development of IT in certain directions, and then we find ways around them. It's just what we choose to investigate.
Well, maybe the future is some sort of matrix, then we just feed something.
Well, maybe we stop eating meat for a start, right? That would hugely boost the numbers of people we can feed on the planet.
If we all lie perfectly still and get fed like liquefied soy
remains
stuff,
of other human beings.
I was trying to avoid that.
That's a matrix solution, but you want to avoid that, yes. Much more classy than me.
And then we live in a dream world where we can walk around and stuff. Yeah, that'll be very efficient.
Yeah,
that would be efficient. If we want to deploy our resources that way, then that's what we'll do. But I don't think that's what any of us would
Leah,
want.
you're very optimistic today. I love that.
So tell us about your worries.
My worries. So first of all, why is there no more homework in this podcast? But I seem to be the only one that worries, so I'm going to have to move on. And my second worry, you've also already sort of taken away, Andy, because I was going to say the Bible has absolutely nothing to say on this. Because, when Leah initially suggested this podcast topic, my first reaction was we should do a series on problems the Bible is no help in.
Well, this could be episode 1 of that series.
So this could be episode 1 of problems where the Bible just doesn't help, and then maybe we discover that it does in some odd way. But what we have in the Bible is this sort of be fruitful, multiply mindset, which makes a lot of sense in the ancient world in a number of ways. There's a lot of space. Environmental crises aren't perhaps as pronounced yet, even though there's famine in the old world. and you show that you're the bigger man by having a big homestead. So all of that makes a lot of sense. But to what extent is that really the guiding principle? Because nowadays it leads us to quite restrictive pronouncements about birth control, for example. Be fruitful, multiply, that's the only way, and therefore we need to, I found evangelicals basically making the argument, but not in a sophisticated way that Leah just made, but only because God said be fruitful, multiply. That must mean those technological solutions exist, and therefore we can find a way. We need to obey this command. And that, to me, is perhaps saying too much. Bible was written in a different context for a different time. So yeah, I don't know. And then if you look a bit further, yes, the Bible does say things about abundancy mindset, and maybe that's something we need to explore. But also, it doesn't really have a lot of answers on how to live together as different nations. Like, there's a lot of things that you shouldn't oppress the downtrodden refugee, but your neighboring nations were still quite, stay away from them and keep them small so you can grow. So that fruitful and multiply very quickly translated into you're my special people, you subdue the earth, you compete with the others. Yes, that changes with Jesus, but also, again, at the expense of an idea of church, at least on behalf of some, that has that same expansionist view. So there's a problem in the Bible with this kind of fill the earth with what you think you should be because you've been told by God to do that. So, yeah. Here's my pitch.
Yeah, so how does that square that you have, like, the foreigner living in your land, you're supposed to look after? I mean, potentially maybe at arm's length, but...
No, I mean, Ruth, she gets integrated. There is that tradition of being generous to the refugee, but the people outside your immediate community, so all of that gets very quickly centered around national communities or ethnic communities, and the people outside of that were evil because they didn't worship your God, and no intermarriage. So in a sense, even if you go with that refugee thing, where then is the integration going to come from? There's still that threat of too much of the outsider, and that certainly is biblical. Solomon brought too many of those wives, and Israel lost its track.
That's always associated with the sort of moral decline, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
The reason for keeping the foreigner out is because they're corrupt.
Yeah, it's a corrupting influence. The pure will be that chosen people.
But is the problem here that we extrapolate something that God was trying to do very specifically through Israel and in a time and a place, and we try and make these things?
Well, I would say that for all of them, yeah. But then be fruitful and multiply is the same thing. It makes sense at a time when there's...
No, I think that's different, because that's right back in Genesis in the Garden of Eden. It seems pretty fundamental to what humans are meant to be about. If I've learned anything,
the world was quite empty at that point.
But that doesn't make it any less real. We've just worked out technological ways in order to continue to do it.
Yeah, but it might. I'm just saying it might be that was a valid commandment when there weren't many people, and now there are plenty of people. It might not be.
We need the next command, next basic command.
We've done the multiplication thing.
Level 1.
Well, maybe it will come. Yeah, maybe when we hit, what would it be? It would be a nice round number like 10 billion.
It might be that the being fruitful and multiply, it doesn't continue to mean reproduction. It just continues to mean, living a fruitful life that is beneficial and your impact is multiplied.
And it's sort of outward looking. So we've talked about
outward looking, yeah.
We've talked about abundance, Leah. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about in terms of the Bible talking about abundance? Are we talking about that be fruitful and multiply, or other bits in the Bible?
That was specifically what I was thinking of, because I think if I've learned anything from the Bible Project, and they are only fallible, they may be wrong, but their big thing is that the patterns are very much laid down in the first few chapters of Genesis. So their series on the blessing, which is what kind of got me thinking about this in the first place, was that it's a pretty fundamental blessing that God gives to all the creatures to multiply and be fruitful, and then specifically to humans to multiply and be fruitful, and to have some sort of godlike jurisdiction over the rest of the world.
And then that leads us to a sort of
important.
Right, and that leads us to a sort of welcoming of people existing as a good thing.
Yeah.
And leads us away from this kind of the country's full, the schools can't take it. I feel like a foreigner in my own streets when you get far enough down that line.
Yeah.
More into these are new friends that I haven't met yet.
Yeah, I think the things are linked, and I think as Christians we need to be very, very careful about how we feel towards population growth, because often the population growth that we're not happy with is population growth of the other, and very often that also coincides with the colour of the people's skin who the population growth is occurring among. So I'm not saying that everybody who's concerned about population growth is a right-wing racist. That would obviously be the extreme, but I don't think there's something of a dotted line between some of those positions that concerns me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's quite interesting that if you look at those two, particularly Hungary and Poland, as two Eastern European countries that lost masses and masses of their young population to other parts of Europe, I think, and from stuff I've read, I think it's not a coincidence that they now have quite strongly right-wing, very strongly anti-immigration governments. That kind of, this idea that we're being outnumbered, that other populations are growing faster than us and we're not keeping up, we're not being fruitful and multiplying, very quickly leads to this fear of the outsider, and not in a good place.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a natural human instinct to feel concerned if you're in a place where you feel like you're the outsider, especially if that's somewhere where you feel like you ought to belong. I went to a women's programming event, and was one of the small number of men in the room and mostly women. It's an experience that's very, very common for women programmers to be in the minority, very rare for male programmers, and it was remarkable what happened to me. I rapidly felt defensive and uncomfortable, and had to sort of examine my emotions carefully. That sense of hang on, I don't belong here, is a really scary and horrible feeling that is behind some of that sense of, I feel like a foreigner on in my own town. Kind of.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, I don't want to push this too much, but we've said for one verse of the Bible, i.e., have a welcoming attitude toward the world and new population, that is eternal. But the idea that we need intact small communities to stay accountable to God, that has somehow outlived its purpose. I mean, I can live with that, and I'm not advocating that the latter is a position to keep. I'm just asking for why we decide that for some things they're not contextual. I mean, this is why I tend to depart with the Bible Project, because they just don't put enough context in there for me. Like, what did it mean at that time to have those words? And then what would it mean? Like, I can much better live with a more metaphorical interpretation of be fruitful, multiply, as, this is, your life's purpose is not to be about yourself. It's about to look out after the existence of humanity, which in those days and age meant be fruitful, multiply, have lots of children, because it's not about you, it's about surviving in this land. Nowadays, perhaps it needs a less literal interpretation and saying the point is to look out after survival of the species and not center the story around whatever serves you, which in some cases might mean not to have children. we decided to have children, and I'm happy we have them, but I fully respect people who say, well, for me, given the ecological crisis, etc., I think my contribution is not to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And now you do what they tell you. And now you do what they told you.
So we've danced around the refugee issue a bit, but we also have a situation in quite a lot of rich countries, including the UK, that fertility rates have gone down quite a lot and are quite low. So then potentially there's a need for people to move into the countries just to balance the population so that enough people are working and paying tax and stuff like that. So, yeah, how far does this abundance mindset fit with that? You know, do we just celebrate our need for others and our connection with others, or do we, are we against all borders because people being able to go where they like is good? Where do we go from that kind of scenario and then the abundance idea?
I'm not a big fan of anarchy. I think that having some rules and control is sensible because it enables you to plan things properly. And I think a lot of the issue in this country is we fail to plan or allow for immigration. We're just so busy trying to squash it. So if we took a proper long hard look at our ageing population and our declining fertility, just on a purely pragmatic basis, I heard a great quote on the radio that we're fast becoming a welfare state with a small economy attached. And it was talking primarily not about universal credit or whatever, it was talking primarily about the size of the NHS that will be needed in order to take care of the needs of all of us ageing people. So it feels sensible, if nothing else, to start a sensible conversation about the need for additional people to come into the country, because I'm not sure that you can sustain an economy such as ours is heading to be, with such a large proportion of older people.
Can we, in terms of planning, can we learn from, how did Germany manage the, I know there were problems, but Germany managed the immigration of a large number of Syrian refugees recently, and there was some planning involved, I assume?
No, there's no planning involved. Germany doesn't have an honest conversation about migration. What Germany's done ever since the war is to bring in unplanned waves of migration, usually in response to some labor demand. And there's a cynical reading that Merkel's turn was also motivated by a realization that this is not just about Syrian refugees, but about the German economy of tomorrow. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily agree with that reading, but that's what some people have said, because the experience of Germany was that whoever came was always going to be told, these are temporary guest laborers. And then, of course, they stayed, and there was ghettoization that took hold because it was never planned, and then usually followed by a restrictive phase of immigration and then another open one. So that story isn't too different from the UK.
Yeah, same kind of thing, isn't it?
So it kind of waves because neither here nor there, people are willing to have an honest conversation. And that, I think, to me, is what an abundance mindset means. It is to look at resources globally and to not look at it in a national point of view and say, okay, we seem to have a lot of money, you seem to have a lot of people. Can we find a way? I mean, obviously this is greatly simplifying it, but I mean, how come we have illegal laborers in Spain harvesting our cucumbers and we're not willing to have a conversation about a green card lottery? And say, but wait a minute, we need those labourers. We'd rather tax those labourers and make sure they live in safe accommodation. But not even the Greens will go near that conversation on a European scale because it's a loser. Because of nationalism, you can't have that conversation. And I want to bet, on that blessed day that somebody other than the Tories get into power in this country, sorry, I'm not sure we're supposed to be signaling political positions, but it seems like there could be other ideas in government. And the way we've set up the conversations around the Home Office is about, but we cannot let people in, rather than saying, what is it we need?
Yeah.
Is really all the low-skilled labour going to come out of British inner-city kids, or is there something else going on here?
Or is it even more cynical and actually these workers are cheaper if they're illegal?
Oh, perhaps, yeah.
Okay. But they just stoke up resentment then, and people just... Yeah.
Well, they're largely invisible, and they... Yeah. Lives are treated as cheap, and yeah.
But it is this really kind of... You have these two extremes, don't you? You have all these rich European countries, particularly, where fertility rates are declining. I mean, I think in the UK we're down at 1.4, 1.5 births per woman, and replenishment is something like 2.1.
2.1.
Yeah.
So we're at 1.4, 1.5 as against 2.1, and then
I think I read Japan was like below 1.
It's Japan and South Korea are like some of the lowest, and then we have these countries primarily in sub-Saharan Africa where, what did you say earlier, Jörg? So the percent of the population that was under 25 in Ethiopia?
Usually around 70%, depending where you are. In Ethiopia, it's around 70% is under 25, yeah.
And we're heading for like 25% being over 60, so...
So Ethiopia... birth rate, or whatever. What do you call that? Births per woman, 3.66. 3.66.
3.6, yeah.
The highest is Niger, 6.93.
And I mean, that isn't pretty either, by the way. There's a number of reasons. So I mean, people will say we like children, and I think we think they're a blessing. There's this abundance mindset. But part of the abundance mindset is also to leave a big imprint on the economy in the sense that I have nobody who's going to take care of me in old age. It's going to be my kids. I better have a few horses in this race because not everybody is going to end in a safe position. And what then often happens in reality is that children get distributed around the country. So if you're in a rural area, you can no longer feed your kids.
And can we just clarify which voice in the family is generally the one having that conversation that isn't perhaps so much of a conversation?
Well, I don't know that that's the case. That would...
The gender, I mean... I'm just
trying
to bring out the gender aspect, right? So the minute you give women more control over their reproductive rights, the birth rate goes down. It's not just a question of replenishment and poverty.
Maybe. I haven't really studied this in relation to Ethiopia, but women are quite strong and birth control is available. So I'm talking, where I have a conversation with people, these are women who are educated, who are in fairly safe positions in rural areas. It may very well be what you say. Yeah,
I don't know the specifics in Ethiopia. That is the picture in...
Well, it's not... You can't say it per country. It's not generalizable. But, there will very well be those families where men just simply say, this is how many kids we're going to have.
Yeah,
but there is a general sense, not just preached by men, but by women alike. It's a good thing to have a lot of children, and supporting one another doing that, and also the way things are set up in terms of who goes to work and does what work. That's changing a bit, though. That's where actually tensions come in, because often the job market seems to be a bit kinder to women in some contexts, and then men are doubly useless in a sense. They can't bear children and don't bring a lot of income. But what I was going to say is that what often happens from high birth rates is also that the domestic servant is, and that often not often, but it occasionally borders slavery. You just pawn one of your children off to the city, usually the girls, and they are the first ones up in the morning. They make the coffee. They, like your maid of 100 years ago in Europe, they have very little education in return. So it's not just a pretty picture of abundance and energy, which it also is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one thing that struck me a few minutes ago when we were talking about the abundance mindset and the ageing population in countries like the UK is people are pretty healthy over 65 in the UK on average. And I feel like part of our abundance mindset should be wanting work to be such a good thing and not this kind of unhealthy thing that we've often made it, that we expect and want to work well beyond what used to be the standard retirement age, making that problem less, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
But I think we'd have to make work a different thing, because people seem to get near that retirement age and they're so exhausted by the treadmill of the kind of Puritan work ethic.
Or you could have a different mindset toward the abundance of work and say, 4 days would make room for another person every 3 workers.
That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Yeah, if we can make work when you're young a bit less intense and more fun, then maybe there's a bit of room for more people to do it.
And there's also the non-paid work aspects of a large healthy older population. There's I imagine the majority of voluntary organisations in this country depend on retired baby boomers who still want to do something. And
a lot of
grandparents looking after kids, and
a lot of that steps in for where the state is failing as well.
Yeah. So I don't want to be a downer on old people. I just think we've got to be the economics are tricky, as you say. If it's a large retired population with increasing health needs versus a small working population, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, I'm glad that unpaid work has come up again. If we valued all that work that's being done by the over 60s, over 65s in our country, it may be through money or maybe through just the way we talk and how visible it is, I think that would change the conversation a lot.
Yeah, that's true. So we're not really feeling the Bible has an awful lot to say, are we? We're struggling a bit. We've got this thing about blessing and be fruitful and multiply that you can kind of interpret in a few different ways, but
yeah, let me come back to the be fruitful multiply, because I kind of looked up the Hebrew roots for that, which again is a bit of a mystical thing to do, because any language has a lot to do with context, but sometimes it helps you get out of one mind space and into another. And basically it just says be fruitful is like you carry a lot of fruit, like a fruit tree, same root. And to multiply is just an intensification of growing, to make grow. And I'm just wondering if we can just take this away a little bit again from the idea that to be fruitful and multiply means to have a lot of kids, because that's the contextual aspect. That's what you needed to do to be a successful man in the old way, in the old days. And maybe can we think about what it actually might mean to have a lot of fruit and make grow? Is there a more metaphorical sense in which we should be reading this? And this is not to prejudge the conversation about how much population the earth can take, but the question is, like, once we interpret it so narrowly, we always come back to this, is this the only contribution humans can make, is to procreate? And then you get very quickly into, when you push the be fruitful, multiply too strongly, then, okay, no birth control, and all the kind of conversations we're now seeing come up in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, where people really want to come back to this kind of world where men dictate how many children women have. Or is there perhaps a more healthy way of really translating this into an abundance mindset, into a gardening mindset, that this planet is given for all, and what now does it mean for us to have a lot of fruit and make grow?
Yeah, so we have this. So one of the questions that I wrote down in our notes was, around about 11 billion people is almost definitely going to happen within the next 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we make that a joyful and wonderful thing instead of just like a impending disaster? And the human resourcefulness and like what Leah was describing seems like the only likely answer, and that would be a fruitfulness. I mean, it already is. Like, so that bloke who invented that high yield wheat or whatever it was, I've forgotten his name, but he's like the person who saved the most lives in history by many times over. That was like human fruitful. That was fruitful.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think we've got to get away from this water that we swim in so much with politics in this country and another number of other countries of this fear. You know, there's so much of rule by fear that's going on, and whatever the right thing is about population growth, it's definitely not biblical to be afraid of growth in populations, whether that's populations that are different to you or populations that are the same as you. I cannot see that fear is God's answer to any of this. So that's a kind of a very general biblical principle, but fear of other and fear of something, kind of, you know, all that horrible language that gets used, like swarms and
It's always liquid. There's always a flow of people.
I think back
or
to
a
some
flood.
of those Brexit posters. You remember that horrible one with, wasn't there all the people that were meant to be Turkish immigrants that were all meant to come in once, you know, Turkey was about to join the EU, and it's just fear mongering.
In a very strange way, though, I was blessed by the conversation around that poster, because in Germany, those kind of, like, the poster was horrible, but it was much more fine-tuned than the kind of, watch out, those foreigners are coming, than what I've ever seen in Germany. Like, I thought it was amazing that such a poster that from the sort of German conversation would have been like, yeah, okay, we see what they mean, caused such a big uproar here. Cool. So in some sense, I thought that was a very healthy reaction that I saw, that it's like, wait a minute, this goes too far. You're depicting a lot of people coming, whereas, like, you know, I don't know, in Germany, there was, the right wing can be a lot more crass.
That was probably the British anti-German sentiment that caused that, because it was linked to a Nazi poster,
or the sort of British sensibility, like, you know, you can kill a man, but don't make it messy. Like, just don't show it. It's not pretty. But just to come back to what you said, Leah, and just taking this a bit further, I mean, the one thing, and we've talked about this before, that really does change between Old and New Testament, is that actually the bounds of nation are broken, or the sort of bound borders are broken, and the church is now imagined as a transnational community from the start, from Acts 2. I mean, that's the whole point, right?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, and then we have the installation, and we have this idea in Acts 4 that everybody sits together and they share. They have this abundance mindset because, you know, it's for everyone. And when that begins to fail, Ananias and Sapphira, things begin to die. Well, in that case, those two, there's a bit of a spiritual murder going on there, but that's another story. But then we have the installation.
That's another one to put on the list of.
That's another one of the list where the Bible isn't helpful. Yes.
think that's a great idea for a series. I'm just not sure that I've got enough knowledge to be part of it.
I posted a lot of we had a lot of themes in Signal already on that.
Yeah, I remember. They're mainly from you.
Yes, getting increasingly bizarre. But in Act 6, then we have the installation of deacons. So there's some regulation to make sure abundance mindset happens, because it doesn't seem to come naturally. But then the church takes care and says we need to find ways of making sure that the resources are distributed evenly in the church. So in some ways, you're right, that the answer then would be to say, well, we are called to be a church that celebrates God's abundance together in the way we share. And when that doesn't, and do that across all national boundaries. And when that doesn't work, in particular around national boundaries, because that's the reason the deacons get brought in, right? The Hellenistic widows begin to complain, and the Jewish widows. Then we need to actually have stronger institutions that make sure that happens.
Yes, and this is why the Millennium Goals are like God's work, right? And they're like the human mission to try and...
says Jörg.
Yeah, well, the Millennium Goals were replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, which, yeah.
I'm not saying they're successful. I mean, they were remarkably successful, but I'm not saying that they've been successful. I'm saying they are God's work.
I think working toward these things and being concerned about all those issues that are in the Millennium Development Goals, also Sustainable Development Goals, is good and important. I'm not so sure that the target and goal language with measuring indicators set by national governments is the right approach, because it basically is just repainting what they do. At least that's what I've seen in my research in this. But that's another conversation, I think.
Yeah,
but you're right. It lands at a very liberal vision of a strong state that distributes resources around the world.
The UN is like the closest to the mission of humanity that we've got.
Or the Antichrist, depending on which side of the church you come from.
Well, it doesn't go unnoticed for me that some people also think it's the Antichrist.
Well, not the Antichrist, but something in Revelation.
Oh yeah, no. There's some evangelicals.
The actual Antichrist. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Once it's the replacement Antichrist for Rome. You can either feel that way about Rome on some evangelical Protestant wings and the UN.
Wow.
So that brings us on actually to our kind of the last thing that we wanted to talk about, which was that we talked about the sort of abundance mindset and like valuing every life, but that is quite an individualistic view. So can we move to less individualistic, more whole species thinking about what it means to celebrate life and celebrate humanity? And linked question, probably more provocative. In nature, we see population collapses quite regularly. So when you were talking, Leah, about not being fearful, should we also not be fearful of a population collapse, like after 2100 or something, maybe earlier with climate change?
That's a really hard question. Well, I don't think we should be fearful of anything. So I mean, that's an easy answer. But realistically,
can we bring about a significant population decline if that's what is needed for our species, which we might not agree on, without starvation and war being the cause?
First of all, are you just saying it's already agreed that that's what's needed?
No.
What we haven't talked about yet, which we kind of mentioned but not really gone into, is resource distribution, and that I heard a shocking statistic yesterday, which was that New York State emits as much CO2 as 40 odd sub-Saharan African countries. I think that was vaguely right. That's
right, and I mean, this goes back to the question of how can we make the population of 11 billion a joyful and great thing. So yeah, go on.
Yeah, so what's interesting about our current government's approach to the climate crisis is that it will not, under any circumstances, try to suggest that people ought to change their behaviour or curtail their lifestyle at all, because or
even insulate their homes,
because that might be spending money on something that they didn't choose to spend money on. So
which would save them money.
We will consume our way out of this crisis according to Western neoliberal capitalism. We will buy electric cars, and we will buy air source heat pumps, and we will buy fancy vegan food, but we will not, under any circumstances, tell people that they ought to reduce or constrain or curtail. That I don't think is abundance mindset. It might sound like it, but it's just selfish.
That's interesting. I agree the government is not doing that, but I would say that our society is saying that to itself.
Yeah, I think we're back to the individual and the communal, aren't we? People as individuals are saying that, but the government is not in any way encouraging or mandating or rewarding it.
And we're not acting collectively in other ways, not just government, right? So like most of the power over this kind of stuff is in the hands of companies, and I don't see us acting collectively to influence those companies in how they behave. And maybe the government would be the way to do that. But
anyway, sorry, slightly off topic. I diverted myself from your tricky question to talk about something else. But
well, no, I think the question of how we're going to live. So the question of how we distribute resources, and therefore how we're going to live with 11 billion people happily, is a very relevant question.
Well, I mean, Leah, you said something in our pre-talk which I found interesting, that it seems that humanity is the only species that has less offspring the more resources are at their immediate disposal. And maybe that is an answer to a sort of a natural reduction, if that is indeed the case and not just a Western idiosyncrasy.
Well, that's the pattern in a lot of countries.
Yeah, it's a lot of Asia as well. It's not just Europe.
Yeah, you're right. Yes, it's especially East Asia.
If you look at the, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But if you look at the GapMinder graph of babies per woman versus income, and then you play the clock forward through time, almost all of the countries move towards higher income and fewer babies per woman. They move on that sort of diagonal line on that graph.
But the problem is, if we have less babies but devote more resources per baby, if we're not careful, we end up in the same ecological footprint, just with less fatter people.
Well, if we're not careful, we're already there. I mean, right? An African family with 6 children consumes less than an American with 2.
Yeah, but if our ambition for that African family is that their country gradually becomes more like our country, then it's even worse.
Yeah, it gets even worse on that level.
Yeah, so we have to curtail our lifestyles somehow, and we have to discover an abundance mindset that doesn't revolve around the possessions we have and the food that we eat. That looks at life in a broader sense than just acquisition.
So just trying to imagine what that looks like, right? Because, like, curtail is definitely not an abundant word.
No.
But so maybe there is abundance in sharing of resources and community, but getting involved in your, groups of people doing things together. That's more of an abundant thing, right?
Well, I suppose it's the car ownership thing, isn't it? The Climate Change Committee put out a report this week and said, the government was making terrible progress on most areas about climate change. And one of the things they said specifically was that it's not enough just to promote people to move from combustion engine cars over to electric vehicles. You've got to also encourage car sharing, increase public transport, increase active transport, i.e. walking and cycling. Now, all of those three things, public transport, shared transport, walking and cycling, actually have this phrase that a lot of climate people seem to be using now, which is co-benefits. It's not just about benefiting the environment. It actually can also benefit society in other ways. Health, well-being, community, less cars on the road, less congestion, all those things. So yeah, curtailment is definitely the wrong word, but it's preaching a change of lifestyle, a curtailment of our individual need to own everything ourselves.
Well, even what we think about as scarcity and abundance, or how we then... So I was just thinking, what if the whole conversation moved to time? There's a scarcity of time for all of us. I haven't yet brought up the fact that we all die, so Andy, here you
Thanks.
go.
Boom.
We might get through a whole episode without being reminded
That's
of that.
right, there you go. No, but it's true. Like once we wrap our heads around that, suddenly, actually, the moment becomes more abundant. Like it becomes more precious. You are more aware of actually scaling up and stopping to look. So we live as if we had abundance of time and scarcity of resources, when actually as individuals we have a scarcity of time and abundance of resources and choices and things that we could be doing. So
I go on.
Go ahead.
I thought you were going to say something different about abundance, which is also that we look on abundance as a very individual thing. You know, how much do I have at my immediate disposal? Do I have a car parked on the drive that means at any moment at the drop of a hat I could choose that I will go somewhere that I choose? Or do we look at abundance in terms of the resources that the community has that might not mean I own quite as much individually, but that actually there's more flexibility and more for everyone because we're all sharing it. But we've had centuries of Western thought where ownership is private. But private property is ownership.
And I mean, those two things are linked in a way when you think then cross-generational. Once I understand the scarcity of my individual time and the abundance of earth time, of human time, that whole conversation and thinking changes. Then it's not my individual goal attainment, but being fruitful and multiply, again, is about the whole garden.
Yeah.
What am I to do with the little time that I do get? And what of that is actually going to stay? What is there for eternity in what I do? And what is just futile and goes away?
Exactly, yeah. When I acknowledge my own death, I certainly think less about acquisition. I think more about what am I passing on to other people. And I think when I'm thinking about other people... Now we're getting
somewhere, Andy. Now we're getting somewhere.
When I'm thinking about passing on to other people, I find it easier to think of that not in terms of acquisition of things, but because actually more than I do in myself, I acknowledge that for other people it's good to pass on.
And you cease less
values. And
you cease less because what you have, what you are doing now, has a value beyond that limited time that we all have.
Yeah, and the things, in particular, the things I don't see as importantly in that passing on.
Yeah.
As the happiness, stuff like that.
You don't have a Philippe Patek watch that you only ever hold on to for the next generation or whatever.
No, what I want to pass on is the computer programs that I've written, because they will last forever.
The algorithms, the idea of programming.
They might do. They probably will. I'm sure I still have bits of code left in Sainsbury's online shopping that will carry on for a good while to come.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. It's remarkable how long things last.
But really what your kids are after is the house, Andy.
Well, we live on a floodplain. Maybe it won't be.
Everything's fleeting. Yeah.
All right. I think we might have run down towards the end. I feel like there's more there about, especially about like becoming less individualistic and like collective behavior, collective thinking, long-term thinking.
Yeah. And intergenerational thinking, thinking about our part in this creation, in a sense that it's not centered around my own individual well-being here now, but my part in that story. So what if God's blessing in Genesis 1:28 isn't to Adam, you there, be fruitful and multiply, or to Eve, you there, but this is what I see you doing as a species, and if you do it right, this will be a beautiful thing.
And even in death, even in the not doing it right, it still adds to the fertility of the ground. I'm just doing Jörg's thing of thinking about the afterlife.
I was just to say, Leah, that was my trick, yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all beautiful.
As long as you haven't had too many hot dogs. That's the thing.
As long as there's not too many microplastics in your corpse.
Oh,
That's
there
right.
are just everywhere now. That's it.
Yeah.
We've had it with that.
By the way, I think microplastics are fine, but that's probably a topic for another day.
I have no view about microplastics. I've got enough to worry about.
But it's another one of those things where the Bible has absolutely nothing to say.
About microplastics.
All right, add it to the list.
Add it to the list.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I think fittingly for this episode, we don't have a neat prayer.
Well, we could read Genesis 1:28.
Oh, you're going to do it? All right, yeah, go for it.
Is that the
Go
verse
for it,
about
then.
microplastics? Or is
Yeah, that's the verse about microplastics, yeah. So 1:27. So God created humans in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in numbers. Fill the earth and subdue it. This is more to talk about here, isn't there? Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all the creatures that move in the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he made. It was very good. And there was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. It's too human-centric.
But we belong in that universe. We belong in the world. It wasn't complete until we were there.
Yeah, and we see the world, we center the world around ourselves. So it is written in our DNA to see it this way. I'm just not convinced that that's going to be sufficient.
But there is a joy to knowing that we belong in it, right? And that we're part of it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Listener, hopefully you've got some more coherent thoughts than us. We'd love to hear them. And see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Killing in the name of, killing in the name of, killing in the name of.
You've been listening to Justice Warriors. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also follow us on social media by searching for Justice Warriors, where warrior is spelt like someone who worries about things. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating, since that helps other people find us. Also, please tell your friends about us in real life. We'd love to hear from you. To get in touch, use the email address in the show notes or contact us via the social media links. Thanks for listening.
And now you do what they told you. And now you do what they told you.